They called them fallen. But that was a lie told to keep them small. A lie whispered by men who feared the power of a woman who could survive without being saved. They called them sinners, outcasts, godless and wild. But when the world turned to dust, when the towns were just scars of wood and whiskey, it was those same women who kept the lights burning. They weren't written into the songs. They weren't painted on the wanted posters. But they were there, always there, when the bullets stopped flying and the blood needed washing from the floors. You can still feel them if you stand still long enough. You can feel them in the quiet before the storm, in the sigh of the wind through ghost towns that forgot their names. They raise still here, the doves who built the West, the women the world pretended not to see. They came to the frontier with nothing but courage stitched to their bones. No man's name to hide behind. No promise of redemption. They worked in rooms lit by lanterns, in places where the law didn't reach and decency turned a blind eye. They poured drinks for the same men who judged them. They laughed to keep from breaking. And when dawn came, they swept the floors of other people's glory. They buried the dead when no preacher would. They held crying children in the shadows of unfinished churches. They stitched. They cooked. They listened. They were the backbone of every so-called civilized town that rose from mud and greed and prayer. And when the dust settled, the world thanked everyone but them. History took their faces and blurred them, took their names and turned them to silence. Because it's easier to worship a legend than to admit who built it. You've heard of the gunslingers, the sheriffs, the outlaws who carved their names into the bones of the West. But tell me this, how many of those names could have survived a single winter without the women who fed them, who patched their clothes, who stood watch while they slept drunk beside a dying fire? You don't know. Do you? You were never meant to. Because history doesn't forget by accident. It forgets by design. It buries the inconvenient, the impure, the unforgettable. And it calls that progress. But truth has a way of clawing its way back through the dirt. You can silence a voice, but not a legacy. You can bury a name, but you can't bury the fire that once spoke it. And that's what this is. A resurrection. A reckoning through memory. Every word you hearing is a shovel hitting that dirt, digging up what was meant to stay lost. If you don't listen, if you don't care, they'll be forgotten again. And this time, it'll be on us. Because silence isn't neutral. It's surrender. You've heard of the cowboys, the lawmen, the legends who tamed the West. But if you don't subscribe, you'll never hear about the women who tamed them. You'll never know who cleaned the blood, who mended the wounds, who built the towns that refused to remember their names. Don't let history win that silence again. Don't be another quiet witness to their erasure. Because every time we speak their names, they rise from the dust. Every time we tell their stories, the lie loses power. Every time we remember, the forgotten become immortal. They called them fallen, but they rose first. And now, it's our turn to rise with them. They called them fallen, but that was a lie told to keep them small. A lie whispered by men who feared the power of a woman who could survive without being saved. They called them sinners, outcasts, godless and wild. But when the world turned to dust, when the towns were just scars of wood and whiskey, it was those same women who kept the lights burning. They weren't written into the songs. They weren't painted on the wanted posters. But they were there, always there, when the bullets stopped flying and the blood needed washing from the floors. You can still feel them if you stand still long enough. You can feel them in the quiet before the storm, in the sigh of the wind through ghost towns that forgot their names. They raise still here, the doves who built the West, the women the world pretended not to see. They came to the frontier with nothing but courage stitched to their bones. No man's name to hide behind. No promise of redemption. They worked in rooms lit by lanterns, in places where the law didn't reach and decency turned a blind eye. They poured drinks for the same men who judged them. They laughed to keep from breaking. And when dawn came, they swept the floors of other people's glory. They buried the dead when no preacher would. They held crying children in the shadows of unfinished churches. They stitched. They cooked. They listened. They were the backbone of every so-called civilized town that rose from mud and greed and prayer. And when the dust settled, the world thanked everyone but them. History took their faces and blurred them, took their names and turned them to silence, because it's easier to worship a legend than to admit who built it. You've heard of the gunslingers, the sheriffs, the outlaws who carved their names into the bones of the West. But tell me this, how many of those names could have survived a single winter without the women who fed them, who patched their clothes, who stood watch while they slept drunk beside a dying fire? You don't know. Do you? You were never meant to. Because history doesn't forget by accident. It forgets by design. It buries the inconvenient, the impure, the unforgettable. And it calls that progress. But truth has a way of clawing its way back through the dirt. You can silence a voice, but not a legacy. You can bury a name, but you can't bury the fire that once spoke it. And that's what this is. A resurrection. A reckoning through memory. Every word you hearing is a shovel hitting that dirt, digging up what was meant to stay lost. If you don't listen, if you don't care, they'll be forgotten again. And this time, it'll be on us. Because silence isn't neutral. It's surrender. You've heard of the cowboys, the lawmen, the legends who tamed the West. But if you don't subscribe, you'll never hear about the women who tamed them. You'll never know who cleaned the blood, who mended the wounds, who built the towns that refused to remember their names. Don't let history win that silence again. Don't be another quiet witness to their erasure. Because every time we speak their names, they rise from the dust. Every time we tell their stories, the lie loses power. Every time we remember, the forgotten become immortal. They called them fallen, but they rose first. And now, it's our turn to rise with them. They said the West was freedom, but they never mentioned the price. Thousands of women left the East with nothing but a name they couldn't bear to live under anymore. Some fled disgrace, some fled men, and some fled the weight of being told to stay in their place. They packed what little they owned, a photograph, a locket, a secret, and stepped into a world that didn't promise survival. There were no laws out here, no safety, no mercy, only dust, hunger, and the sound of boots moving towards something that looked like hope from far away. Some came as wives, thinking they'd find a fresh start. Some came as widows, hoping to forget the graves they left behind. And some came alone, with fire in their chests and no one left to tell them what not to do. They were called reckless. They were called desperate. But the truth is simpler. They were the first to understand that sometimes the only way to live clean is to walk through dirt. The men staked claims on land. The women staked claims on survival. When money ran dry, they did what they had to do. Laundry, cooking, nursing, and for some, the kind of work respectable women whispered about in disgust, but secretly envied for its independence. The frontier had no pity for reputation. It only respected endurance. And those women endured everything. They slept in shacks that could barely hold out the wind. They birthed children with no doctor, buried them with no priest. They fought off men who mistook hunger for permission. They stitched their own wounds and went back to work before they healed. Every mile west demanded a sacrifice. A piece of safety, a piece of innocence, a piece of themselves they'd never get back. And still, they kept walking. Because out there, in the emptiness, something powerful was growing. Something that wasn't shame. Wasn't obedience. It was ownership of their choices, of their bodies, of their stories. They built a world inside a world that refused to claim them. They carved respect from the same stone that men used to build saloons and jails. They were laughed at, blamed, bought, and abandoned. And yet, they became the foundation of everything that followed. Every plank of every bar, every washed shirt on a line, every child who grew up to call himself a pioneer, all of it carried their fingerprints. But you won't find that in the history books. You won't find their names beside the railroads or the ranches. Because history has a way of pretending that survival is only noble when a man does it. But those women knew better. They didn't need statues. They didn't need songs. They needed to eat. They needed to live. And that, in the end, was enough. They called it sin. They called it shame. But what it really was strength. Dressed in the only clothes the frontier allowed. And that's the truth they never wanted you to hear. Because once you see what these women endured, the old stories stop sounding like glory and start sounding like theft.
They called it sin, they called it shame, but what it really was strength dressed in the only clothes the frontier allowed. And that's the truth they never wanted you to hear. Because once you see what these women endured, the old stories stop sounding like glory and start sounding like theft. So remember this, the West didn't rise because of who conquered it, it rose because of who survived it. And most of them were women. They called them fallen, but out here, where the world began again, they were the first to stand. They called it sin, but sin built the West. The preachers wouldn't say it, the historians wouldn't write it, but the truth doesn't care who it embarrasses. It was the soiled doves, the women they called impure, who kept the frontier alive when the mines went dry and the men drank their pay. It was the women behind red doors and boarded windows, who made sure the towns didn't collapse under their own hunger. Their earnings kept the lights on, their taxes built the roads, their labor kept lawmen paid and sheriffs standing proud in their boots. Brothels, boarding houses, gambling halls, the holy trinity of survival, places the righteous passed in daylight but visited in the dark, and every coin that crossed those thresholds was a confession carved in silver. Without them, there would have been no West, no schools, no jails, no fire brigades to put out the flames of the dreams men set on fire every Saturday night. The men called them shameful, but when the saloons burned, it was their money that bought the water. When the mines collapsed, it was their donations that buried the dead. When children starved, it was their hands that fed them. Julia Boulette, Virginia City's most infamous, fallen woman, paid for the uniforms of the firemen who later carried her coffin. She gave to hospitals, to schools, to the same community that refused to sit beside her in church. And when she was murdered, the whole town mourned her like a saint they'd never admit she was. Men lined up in silence, tipping their hats to a woman they'd loved in secret and shamed in public. That was the way of things back then. The world took what it needed from women like her, then buried the evidence. It called them sinners, then built its future with their earnings. Every time a town boasted its progress, a woman's dignity had been traded for it. Every paved road was paid for by footsteps that were never meant to be honored. Every church steeple pointed heavenward, because women the world refused to see kept the ground beneath it from falling apart. That's the truth no one likes to say out loud, because it forces you to ask, who really built the West? The men with their rifles, or the women who bought the nails? It was a soiled economy, yes, but so was everything born of survival. And for those women, survival was salvation. They didn't have the luxury of purity. They only had the choice between starving quietly, or living loudly in a world that pretended not to hear them. And still, they stood. Painted lips, tired hands, proud hearts. They smiled through shame, and turned stigma into stone foundations. That's the story no one wants to tell, because it changes everything. It makes the West less about heroes, and more about the forgotten women, who made it possible for those heroes to even exist. If you walk away now, you'll leave them buried twice, once by history, and once by your silence. Subscribe, so their names aren't ghosts in the algorithm too, because the truth is still here, waiting to be spoken again. And every time you listen, they rise a little higher. They called it sin, but sin built salvation. And the West was built by the hands no one dared to bless. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own land in their own names. They couldn't walk through the front door of a church without feeling eyes burn through them. But when the town was burning, when the men had drunk themselves blind and the sheriff was on his knees, it was their money that saved the place. They called them madams, but they were more than that. They were governors of the forgotten, queens of the alleys, matriarchs of the midnight hour. While the world slept, they built empires in the dark. Fanny Porter, San Antonio's most infamous madam, kept her girls safer than the law ever did. Her house fed outlaws, sheltered runaways, and bought silence when justice came with a price tag. When the Pinkertons came hunting, they knocked on her door first, not to arrest her, but to ask her what she knew. And she always knew everything, because power listens where others only speak. Big Nose Kate, lover, nurse, survivor, legend. She saw the West for what it was, a man's dream built on a woman's endurance. When they called her a harlot, she laughed. When they called her dangerous, she smiled, because danger was all she had ever known, and she had learned how to use it. They ruled their worlds from behind lace curtains and whiskey-glazed mirrors. Their parlors were the first city halls. Their ledgers held the real records of the town, the debts, the favors, the secrets that held every man by the throat. Men made the laws, but these women enforced them, not with guns, but with memory. They knew who stole, who killed, who begged on his knees when the lights went out. They couldn't vote, but every decision that mattered passed through their doors first. They couldn't hold office, but when the town needed a school or a fire wagon, it was their gold that made it happen. They were the shadow mayors of the frontier, the unacknowledged heartbeat of progress. And every time they bought bread for orphans, or paid the preacher's debts, the world called it sin, because the truth would have made the righteous look small. Power like that doesn't come from permission. It comes from endurance, from knowing how to survive when the world insists you shouldn't. They were the first women to understand what real freedom costs. They were the first to pay for it in full. But history couldn't handle that kind of truth, so it wrote them off as temptresses, as villains, as stains on the story of the West. Because it's easier to shame a woman than to admit you owe her everything. Pause, voice lowers, almost a whisper. History shamed them to make us forget what power looks like. Don't be part of that lie. Hit subscribe, or tell me in the comments why their stories don't deserve to rise again. Because if you stay silent, you're helping the same men who buried them the first time. And silence is complicity. They couldn't vote, but they ruled anyway. They couldn't pray in peace, but they built the towns the faithful lived in. They couldn't be saints, so they became legends. They were the matriarchs of the midnight hour, and every light that still burns in the West was lit by their hands. They say the West was built by men with guns, but that's only half the story. The other half was built by women with blood on their hands and prayers on their lips. They were the midwives, the healers, the nurses who stitched together a civilization while the world called them unclean. They didn't wear badges or uniforms. They wore courage and the stains of other people's pain. In the beginning, there were no hospitals, no doctors for 100 miles, only women who learned by doing, who risked their own lives to bring others into the world. When a woman screamed in labor under a leaking roof, when fever took a child in the dead of night, it wasn't the preacher or the sheriff who came. It was her, the one they whispered about, the one they said had seen too much, the one who knew the line between life and death by touch alone. She carried salvation in a bucket in a steady hand, hot water, clean rags, and faith. Faith that somehow, one more birth might balance the scales of all the dying. They gave birth to the West, literally and quietly, and for that, they were both needed and shunned. The respectable women called them crude, the men called them witches, but when the hour came, everyone called for them. They were the first to hold new life, and the last to wash the dead. They were nurses before there were hospitals, doctors without a name, saints without a church to kneel in. Some kept journals, pages filled with shaking handwriting, detailing the nights they spent kneeling beside women they barely knew. Some wrote of stillbirths, some of miracles, some of both in the same breath. And when they died, their journals were thrown away, their words burned with the linens they left behind. But they built something that outlasted all of it. Every time a baby took its first breath in a shack or tent, a new piece of the West was born too. Not the West of outlaws and gold, but the West of families, of bloodlines, of survival, that looked like mercy. They held hands through pain that history forgot to mention. They buried mothers, they buried infants, and still, they showed up again the next day, because to them, life was not a profession. It was a promise that no one would have to face the darkness alone. They stood between life and death every day, unpaid, unnamed, but indispensable. The silent architects of humanity itself. And when they grew old, the same towns they built turned their backs, called them relics, called them sinners for touching bodies that, respectable, people refused to. But respectability never saved a life. They did. So when you hear the word civilization, remember who carried it on her back. It wasn't the generals or the preachers. It was the woman kneeling beside a dying stranger, whispering, "Breathe, just breathe." The West was born in their hands. And though the world tried to forget them, the land never did. Every wind that sweeps across it still sounds like the breath they fought to keep alive. If their stories fade, so does the truth of what it took to make this place human. Don't let them vanish again. Subscribe, not for me, but for the ones who built everything, and were thanked with silence. Because when we stop remembering them, we buried them a second time. And some stories should never be buried again. They were the midwives of civilization, and without them, the West would have never been born at all. They didn't ride with guns, they rode with books. They came on wagons, on foot, on hope, carrying nothing but chalk, scripture, and a promise to civilize a wilderness that didn't want to be tamed. Teachers, missionaries, runaways, women with nowhere else to go, and everything to give. They built schools in places where even churches feared to stand, mining camps, railway towns, outposts that didn't even have names yet. Their classrooms were made of dirt floors, whiskey crates, and the sound of children reciting letters under a leaky roof. They taught miners' sons to read, prostitutes' daughters to dream, and orphans to believe they weren't forgotten. Every lesson was a battle, every word a rebellion against the darkness that surrounded them. They were told they were wasting their lives, that the West was no place for women with ideals, but they came anyway, because they knew ignorance kills faster than bullets. Sarah Winema knew that too, a Paiute woman who stood before senators and settlers, teaching them that education wasn't charity, it was survival. She spoke 5 languages, translated treaties that men lied about, and when no one would listen, she built her own school with her own hands. A native woman teaching both her people and her oppressors what civilization really meant. The newspapers mocked her, history buried her, but her students remembered, and so should we. Others followed her path, nameless teachers who crossed deserts and mountains for the chance to give children a future they would never see themselves. They wrote their own curriculums on scraps of paper. They lit candles when the sun went down, and kept teaching while coyotes howled outside. Some of them were orphans themselves, children who grew up without parents, then became the mothers of towns. They weren't paid in gold or glory, just gratitude, and the faint hope that maybe one of their students would live a softer life. They didn't teach for money. They taught so the next generation wouldn't have to crawl out of ignorance alone. They taught so that, one day, a woman's voice could be more than a whisper in a man's story. And when the mines dried up, and the towns fell silent, their schools became the last buildings standing, a monument not of stone, but of ink and patience and prayer. They built the moral backbone of a land too wild to care for its own. They were the frontier's quiet rebellion, proof that civilization isn't made by guns or gold, but by the people who teach you how to spell mercy, how to count hope, how to read your own worth. Beat, soft, mournful pause. And yet, when history tells the story of the West, their names are missing. No statues, no plaques, just dust and echoes of children's voices, in places that no longer exist. But make no mistake, every town that survived, every community that rose from chaos, stood on their lessons, on their discipline, on their light. They fought to teach strangers how to read, and we can't even remember their names. Don't be the viewer who forgets by morning. Subscribe, keep their names alive, because if we stop speaking them, they vanish again into the silence they fought to break. Or if you won't, tell us why. Tell us why a woman who carried knowledge across deserts isn't worth one click, one act of remembrance. Let your silence speak, but remember, silence is how they were erased the first time. They were the educators and the outcasts. They taught the West how to think, how to read, how to dream, and in doing so, they taught it how to be human. They built churches and saloons on the same street, 2 altars, 2 kinds of salvation. One promised forgiveness, the other, forgetfulness. And between them stood the women, their hands calloused from building both. On Sunday mornings, they knelt in the church they'd paid for, their donations gathered from brothels and boarding houses, from coin purses filled with money no priest would bless. On Saturday nights, they poured drinks for the same men who'd pray beside them. The next day, the preacher and the bartender both knew their names, but only one admitted it out loud. That was the paradox of the West. Faith and sin, standing shoulder to shoulder, pretending they weren't kin. Religion offered redemption, but never forgiveness. Forgiveness is mercy, and mercy was a currency too rare for the frontier. The same women who funded the steeples were denied seats in the pews. Their money was pure enough to build the church, but their presence wasn't pure enough to sit in it. They were ghosts at the edge of grace, welcomed for their labor, shunned for their lives. The saloon gave them something the church never could: honesty. In the saloon, no one pretended to be righteous. There was no false purity, no polite lies about who deserved heaven, just survival, raw, loud, and unashamed. But still, they kept their hymn books beside their shot glasses. They whispered prayers before lighting lanterns for men who'd never know their names. They sang psalms through whiskey breath, and hope that counted for something. They carried both faith and shame, like 2 sides of the same coin. One they flipped every morning to decide who they had to be that day. The church took their tithes, the saloon took their youth, and both called them sinners in the end. But history never asks who kept the candles burning, who cleaned the floors after Sunday service, who nursed the drunks the sermons couldn't save. It never asks who taught the children the words to Amazing Grace, when their fathers were gambling their pay away a few doors down. Those women were the backbone of a faith that never claimed them. They prayed without permission. They built holiness out of heartbreak. And they learned to believe in a God who might love them, even if his followers never did. The West pretended you had to choose church or saloon, sinner or saint. But the truth is, the women who built both knew there was never a choice. Because when the town was dying, they were the ones who kept both doors open. They prayed over graves by daylight and poured whiskey by nightfall. They baptized babies in the same basins they washed blood from. They stitched salvation out of contradiction. And when history came calling, it called them fallen. But the truth, they were the only ones who ever rose. Because faith without struggle is easy. Faith inside the saloon, faith carried by the damned, that's real. And maybe that's what built the West after all. Not the sermons, not the laws, but the quiet, relentless grace of women who believed anyway. The church rang its bells for the righteous. The saloon sang for the broken. But only the women between them knew that both songs were really the same. He said the West died, that the dust settled, that the stories faded into history books no one reads anymore. But that's a lie. The West didn't die, it changed shape. It's in the blood of every woman who refuses to bow, every voice that won't quiet down when told to. It's in the women who lead, who build, who rise, and get called names for it. Sound familiar? Because that's the echo. That's their legacy still breathing through us. The women they called fallen were the foundation. The ones they shamed were the ones who built the world that judged them. They weren't just survivors. They were architects of towns, of futures, of freedom itself. And every woman who dreams too loud today, every girl who dares to take up space, every mother who carries her family through another storm, she's carrying their spirit too. The same fire, the same defiance, the same unbreakable will that tamed the wild long before men took the credit. They may not wear corsets now, or ride horses through the desert, but the fight is the same. The woman running her own business, they'd call her greedy. The one who speaks her mind, they'd call her difficult. The one who chooses her own path, they'd still whisper, fallen. But every time a woman refuses to apologize for her strength, the old frontier breathes again. Every time she chooses her own name over the one given to her, the dust remembers, and the past bows its head in recognition. Their grit became our inheritance, their defiance, our rhythm, their survival, our birthright. The cowgirls who rode wild, the teachers who taught hope, the midwives who birthed futures, the soiled doves who paid the town's bills while being banned from its streets, they all live here in the marrow of our modern world. Every skyscraper still stands on their calloused hands. Every voice that demands to be heard is another verse in the hymn they started. We call it progress, but they called it survival. And survival, that's the truest legacy of all. Pause, voice softens, almost breaking, because if they could rise through fire and judgment, through loneliness and loss, what excuse do we have to stop remembering them now? Their names may be buried, but their spirit isn't. It's in every step we take, every dream we dare, every truth we speak out loud, even when no one wants to hear it. They were the beginning, we are the continuation. Their legacy isn't written in books, it's written in blood, ours, and as long as we remember, they never really died. The frontier may have faded from the map, but it still rides with us, in every woman who knows her worth, and refuses to be quiet about it. They called them fallen, but they rose first, and because of them, we still rise. They called them fallen women, but the towns they built still stand. The roads they paved still carry names that aren't theirs, and the echoes of their prayers still ride the wind through every hollow street the world forgot. They were the mothers of the West, the unholy saints, the builders no one blessed, the voices buried under someone else's glory. They were told they weren't worth remembering, but here we are, still speaking them into the dust. Because the truth is simple, they never fell. The world just looked away. If the wind could speak, it would whisper their names louder than any preacher ever dared. Names carved in silence. Names the history books left blank. Names that still hum through the bones of every frontier ghost town. They never asked to be saints. They asked to be seen. And maybe that's the holiest thing of all. To live in a world that calls you lost, and still rise every morning to build it anyway. They weren't the ruins of a broken world. They were the foundation of the one we live in now, and the dust remembers them, even if we forget. You can scroll past this just like the world scrolled past them. You can move on, like history always does. Or you can stay, you can subscribe, and make sure their stories never fall silent again, because every voice that joins this remembrance keeps them alive a little longer. The West remembers those who remember it. They called them fallen, but the truth is the doves never fell.